Hello and welcome to Know This Live. I'm Zinhle Essamuah. Joining me today first on Now This is a very special guest, President Biden's special envoy for climate, John Kerry. Secretary Kerry was just with President Biden moments ago when he signed the climate-focused executive orders. Thank you so much for being here with us.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Of course,
Thank you.
of course. At the White House press briefing, you just said that the climate crisis is an issue where failure is not an option. So talk to us and the skeptics about what climate success might look like.
Well, in the immediate moments of this year, going from now till November, we have a critical international gathering, a negotiation internationally in Glasgow, which is the follow-on to the Paris Agreement. And many of us believe that this is the last real opportunity for the major developed countries that emit most of the greenhouse gas emissions that are creating the problem, for them to get on a track towards being net zero by 2050, if not sooner. And sooner should be in everybody's mind, because the course we're on right now is literally, it's dangerous. It's unsustainable. It's going to cost lives. It's going to be massive dislocation of people, food production, water interruption. I mean, we're not in a good place. And unfortunately, we've lost 4 years under the Trump administration. So we have a lot of time to make up for.
Yeah, and I want to talk about some of that danger that you're alluding to. I know that as special envoy for climate, you're also a full-time principal member for climate on the White House's National Security Council. So when it comes to national security, what is at risk when it comes to climate?
Well, let me be very explicit. The Pentagon used to have, until Trump came in, a climate office where people were really focused on what are the compounded threats that come from the climate crisis. And they range from, things like Norfolk, Virginia, where we have the largest Navy port, and our fleet is positioned there. Well, already a few years ago when I was Secretary of State, I went down there and I was briefed by the admiral who was the commander of the base, and they said, we're looking at how we're going to actually get our people to the base, to the ships in the event of an emergency. They're going to have to rebuild massive resources there because some of it's going to go underwater as sea level rise increases. But, you run around the world, there are populations in certain parts of the world already poor, already without the kinds of resources that a lot of people have in their countries. And as their country maybe becomes completely uninhabitable, last year in parts of the Middle East, it was 130 degrees Fahrenheit. In Antarctica, it was 70 degrees, which obviously has a profound impact on the ice melting, therefore sea level rise. But all of these things compound on each other. So fragile populations will be at great risk. And if they're living in one of those uninhabitable areas, what do you think they're going to do the minute that it gets that bad? They're going to move. They're going to move en masse. And so you're going to have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of people who can't live where they have been living. Therefore, where do they go? Are they going to knock on the door of Europe the way refugees did out of Syria and Turkey during the war in Syria? I mean, you have the potential with the melting of ice that the supply of water that annually flows into the great rivers of the world that feed people and around which they live, the Yangtze, the Ganges, the Yellow River, the Mekong River. I mean, there are massive rivers out there that depend on the Himalayas for the flow. If that melts off over the next century, 2 centuries, then you're going to have, again, massive dislocation. And what the Pentagon decided in the analyses they made when they had the office is that climate crisis, climate change, is a threat multiplier. It just grows different threats. And we need to understand that better, which is why today, President Biden signed an executive order requiring our 17 different intelligence units, our intelligence agencies, to all come together with an intelligence assessment of the impact of climate to our security. So we're starting really to make up for lost time. and deal with this in the very, very serious way that we ought to be.
Yeah, and it's clear that the threat of climate is definitely one that compounds. I'm glad you mentioned climate refugees. We know from the Brookings Institute that 100 million climate refugees are expected by 2050. And so knowing that, which is a really harrowing number, are you having conversations with President Biden about this growing issue and threat? And what might policy around climate refugees look like?
Absolutely. I mean, not only we had conversations with him during the campaign, but today he responded to all those conversations and to the needs of many diverse inputs on this subject. And he issued a very broad set of executive orders that will set up a domestic platform from which a domestic national climate advisor will help organize our agencies, the various departments of the government, bringing them all together to get all of them invested in the effort to deal with the climate crisis. It ought to be part of every single policy made everywhere in government. That's what President Biden did today. And he's the first president to ever do that. He's the first president to ever ask the intelligence community of all communities where you ought to be getting an assessment of what the impact on your people may be, on your nation, on your flow of goods, on your food, on your ability to live. You need your intelligence community invested in this. And thanks to President Biden's signature today on this order, that's exactly what we're going to do.
Yeah, and it's clear that many different areas of the government now will have leading climate experts at the helm. We do know that some high-ranking Democrats want President Biden to declare a climate emergency. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think we are in an emergency. Obviously, the declaration has certain implications that have got to be carefully evaluated. But I think it's something that's got to be analyzed. We've only been in, the president's only been here for what, a week, I guess? It's hard to believe it's only a week. It feels like a lot longer. But so he's got all of his staff involved in a process of trying to evaluate all the options that he has available to him. And I think we need to let the president have the space to be able to analyze that and make and decide what his best options are.
Yeah, and I mean, I do note some hesitancy in your voice, which is interesting given what a priority climate appears to be to the Biden administration. What goes into making a declaration like declaring the climate crisis an emergency?
You actually don't have any hesitancy from me. I think it is absolutely worth the evaluation. I think we are in an emergency. But as I said, you've got to understand all the implications politically, congressional, Congress, House, Senate, the budget implications, all of those things have got to be analyzed and looked at before you make that kind of decision. But there's every reason to believe we have to move as if we're in a war. We have to move as if it is an emergency, whether you declare it or not. And as I said, I think we have to analyze whether or not that would positively affect things with respect to the choices and the decisions the president could make.
Of course, and that, of course, is a bit more domestically focused. Of course, you are no stranger to the international realm. And there's a reality that to be viewed as credible in the international space, it's important to walk the walk and walk the talk at home. So given the many rollbacks that we saw from the Trump administration in the last 4 years, how does the U.S. re-engage in the global climate arena? And what did we lose out on? What did we lose in the last 4 years?
Well, President Biden did not waste any time in reengaging. On day one, within hours of his being inaugurated and taking the oath, he issued instructions to prepare a diplomatic instrument to get us back into the Paris Agreement. So we're now counting the days and marching down to we're formally back into the Paris Agreement. In addition, the president has reached out to leaders around the world. He's beginning a traditional series of initial phone calls that an incoming president makes. But he is very, very heartened. I just was with him a few minutes ago, and he told me personally that he's amazed at the response he's getting from people around the world to the fact that he is now making this a central issue. They're elated, and they want the United States to be back. So we have a lot of work to do to restore our credibility Unfortunately, the Trump administration went in exactly the wrong direction without any real rationale other than petty politics. And they hurt America's credibility in the world. So that's one of the things the president is thinking about as to how he is going to restore that credibility. And it will begin by our coming up with our own domestic program by which we join other nations in doing our part to make sure we are addressing it here at home. That means new energy possibilities. It means supporting electric vehicles. It means transitioning on certain kind of fuels. There's just a whole host of options the president put into the executive order today, all of which are going to be on the table, and we'll be kicking those around and figuring out the road ahead literally immediately.
Yeah, and you mentioned, some of the many calls that a new administration and president will field from other countries. Are there other countries whose climate policies we want to emulate? Have you heard that directly from President Biden, or are there other countries that you specifically are looking at?
Well, yes to both. I mean, there are countries that have done amazing things. Europe has been leading in our absence, and we should congratulate Europe for that. Our European friends have been really stalwart in staying at the process of reducing emissions and laying the groundwork for this conference we're going to have at the end of this year. But I think that, you could look at what some of the Scandinavian countries have done. You could look at, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, they're great examples of good stewardship. You have other countries. Germany has made some very tough decisions with respect to coal and nuclear. They are, and there are a lot of good actors within that particular group of folks. There are other countries, though. New Zealand has taken steps. Increasingly, there are people taking this seriously in the Middle East and around the world. I mean, leaders around the world have come to the realization this is not a hoax. This is not a phony political deal. It doesn't belong to one party in one country or another. This is a real scientific event happening where the chemistry of the ocean is changing more than it has in 50 million years. You have warming of the ocean, which is affecting the fires that we see around the world. There's greater moisture in the air. In addition, we have floods that we didn't have in a repetition. You have major 500-year floods happening, every other year or something in certain places. So all around the world, you will find good actors, you'll find bad actors, you'll find people who are somewhat powerless to be able to help themselves because they don't have money, they don't have the structure. But by and large, the major developed nations of the world need to come together, and they've got to decide how they're going to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, for which they are responsible for about 85% of all the emissions.
Right. And how do we press then countries like China, who are averse to engaging in these environmental policies, considering how we have been oriented and positioned in the last 4 years?
Well, China was not adverse to working on this with the Obama administration. China was very key to helping to get the Paris Agreement to come together, because the United States and China came together, worked together, put together an opportunity to have a working task force. And then we announced our reductions, and that gave great momentum to the movement of Europe. Now, I think the formula may be different this year. We don't know yet. We're just getting in. But we have to have a lot of conversations with a lot of people, and that's what we're going to do.
And you mentioned during a press conference earlier that some of the fastest growing jobs before the pandemic were in clean energy and clean power. That speaks positively to young people who may be looking for jobs. But then what do you say to those who may be unemployed workers now? How do you get them into the mix? And how do you speak to the concerned oil and gas workers as well?
We need to put them to work. We need to absolutely put them to work. We need to keep them in their communities where they live. We need to make sure that the factories are coming to those communities, whether it's a new electric car factory or it's making blades for windmills or turbines or whatever. We have great need for people to work in this field, and it's critical. I've had conversations with some of my friends involved in this about how we could create some demonstration projects in those communities so people can see it's not just political talk, It's actually real economic policy that has a consequence, a positive one, on their lives.
Yeah, and there's been a large emphasis from you and the administration as a whole saying that it's more expensive to ignore the climate crisis than to address it. I do wonder, have you considered offering subsidy programs to businesses or workers who may need to learn new skill sets to transition to these new industries? What is that practically looking like?
I think there's a practicality depending on what the particular business or product or initiative is that you're thinking about subsidizing. I mean, years ago, we had not us, but people who preceded us in the late 1800s and the early 1900s provided very generous incentives to oil and gas. And oil and gas has had those incentives for years and years. Well, now is not the time to be providing incentives to oil and gas. You need to provide them to hydrogen fuel or alternative renewable energy, or there are various ways to get off of greenhouse gas producing fuels. And I hope I think that is part of the plan going forward. But the sooner we do that, the sooner we will encourage behavior, choices that are beneficial to us. An example of that, a lot of mayors, a lot of communities, the municipality has it has a vehicle fleet, and various people in the various departments need to get around and do their jobs. But those vehicles should all be electric now. There's no excuse for them not being electric, literally. And if you provided a greater incentive to take the price down even a little more so it becomes more attractive to a lot of people, boom, you can create fleet purchases for mayoralities or for the Department of Public Works or whatever the entity of government is that you're trying to help shift. And that would be enormously helpful for everybody. Because the more you buy those vehicles, the more you sell those vehicles, then the cheaper it's going to get, and then more and more people can begin to do it, and you've suddenly created a virtuous cycle.
Yeah, it's clear that you all are clearly trying to think in an innovative way about this new type of power. And, you also are the highest ranking U.S. official to ever visit Antarctica. You've paid special attention to the Arctic and the global ice melt. But a study put out this week did say that the ice sheets are melting at a rate faster than we've ever seen before. How do you plan to come back to that? And what is the deadline before it's too late, considering how fast this is all happening?
Well, we're coming back to it. I mean, the Arctic are front and center in the things we have to think about how we can have a positive impact. But the key to Antarctica and the key to the Arctic, because it's so large and massive and it's being so profoundly negatively affected by warming, you got to stop the warming. And stopping the warming begins by reducing the greenhouse gases and then getting some of the greenhouse gases that are locked into the atmosphere now that have been going up there for, centuries. You've got to begin to suck that out too. That is a challenge we don't yet know. I mean, we have some direct air capture of carbon, and that happens in certain places. But on the scale we're going to have to do this, we still have a lot of work to do.
And it sounds like there's a lot of unity within the administration about prioritizing climate. As a fellow Bostonian, I try and keep up with local news, and it's not lost on me that recently the Sunrise Movement held a protest outside of your home, which is signaling mounting pressure for the U.S. to continue to cut its use of fossil fuels. How are you thinking about how to address the real demands of an increasingly divided country and even Democratic Party?
Well, we have to tell people the truth. I mean, a lot of people have been divided by lies. A whole bunch of folks believe what they believe, and it's a lie because they were fed the lie purposefully. So we have to begin by making sure we're dealing with truth here. People have got to know they're not being lied to. They've got to know what the facts are to be able to make a smart choice for their life. And I think the Sunrise Movement and other movements of young people have been spectacular. I give them huge credit. They've helped shake, the adult population. They've helped say to government, hey, we're tired of the rhetoric. You got to get serious. What are you going to do? And they're asking their parents, what have you done, Mom? What have you done, Dad? What are you contributing in order to save the world for us? And it's a legitimate feeling by people. So what do we got to do? We've got to rapidly reduce those emissions. We ought to be moving as if we were, literally at war. When you're at war, you decide you got to go all out because you got to win. It's survival. Well, this is survival. This question of what's happening with climate is a matter of survival. And already we're seeing far too many species wiped out off the face of the earth. We're seeing a reckless gaming of Mother Nature where nobody really knows exactly what the consequences are going to be. That is dangerous stuff. When you unleash the force of things you don't understand, and you unleash the force of things that are destructive, what we've got to do is kind of pull ourselves together and find the facts if we don't know them, talk the truth to each other, lay out all the options, and make our democracy work by choosing the best way forward.
Yeah, and it's notable that you highlight how urgent this is, right? We know that the climate crisis also has serious public health consequences, right? Whether it's asthma, black lung. What stories have you maybe heard? I know you referenced some in the press conference that are driving you to push for this change.
Well, there's so many different things. There really are. There are cancers that are exacerbated, if not given, by quality of air, quality of water, where you live. Environmental justice is increasingly a concern and should be of people all over the planet, because invariably the folks who are the most hurt are the folks who are the poorest and the folks who live in the hardest, toughest communities. Those diesel trucks get routed through Bronx, and they get routed through, neighborhoods that don't have the political clout to prevent that. And a lot of people get sick from that. So there has to be justice in this process as we go forward, fairness. I think we have to look quickly at the choices we have available to us to be able to have the greatest impact on pulling us back from the precipice as fast as possible. Now, I don't want to sound, it's hard here, because if you're talking the facts and you tell the truth, there's some pretty dire possibilities staring us in the face. On the other hand, the reality is we still have time, according to the scientists. If we will get the political will and start to really focus on the real choices, we can turn this around. And it is not a question of losing your job or living a worse life, or either you take care of your jobs or you take care of the environment. Wrong. Taking care of the environment is taking care of jobs. It can provide more jobs, better jobs. And there are all kinds of pluses to providing greater security for our nation, because we don't have to worry about sending troops somewhere in the world to fight for our energy supplies. And there's also the virtue of having less particulates in the atmosphere, which people breathe and create complications, whether it's asthma or emphysema, or potentially lung cancer and other things that people get. So life on the other side of the doing of this is, I am convinced, exactly the kind of thing that people on the right, left, center, liberal, conservative, I don't care who you are, you want to live in a place that is clean, that doesn't make you sick, doesn't kill you, and you want your children to be able to grow up and have a better opportunity for a future. That's what this is about. And I think we have an opportunity over the course of these next few years to make gigantic leaps forward. We will discover things that we don't have today. We're going to get 20, 25 days of battery storage one day somehow, or another kind of storage that will help us to get over the hurdle of having to put a gas plant out there because there's no other way to run the factories when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining. We need to do things that are sensible. And I'm convinced that if we do this fast enough, all of us together, we're going to create a very exciting set of economic possibilities.
What you're saying has reminded me of something you said during a press conference, which was that 2021 will be marked not just by promises, but progress, specifically making up for the time lost in the last 4 years. I do wonder who has to give, what needs to be sacrificed, whether it's economically, in order to make these, as you're outlining, very large gains.
Well, honestly, I think the sacrifice is minimalist. I think you know, if we do this in a smart way, if we take the jobs and make sure they're going to be started up in the places where they may have been losing some, then you can create a seamless transition, or almost seamless, where people get the job training. People are helped to be able to transition to a different job, a better job, more money, cleaner perhaps. I mean, this can happen. There's nothing out of reach in what I just said, providing we have the willpower to want to go out and make it happen. But if you don't try, you'll never know, number one. But number two, if you don't do this, we're just not going to make it. We're going to be in a terrible, terrible place in the next 30 years.
And of course, we know that the effects that we're going to feel are often first felt by communities of color who are also disproportionately impacted by the effects of the climate crisis. What specifically are you focusing on to make sure that these communities are center in upcoming policy, but also in terms of retroactive injustices that may have happened?
Well, it's what I just said. I mean, it's really the question of bringing jobs to those communities, keeping the diesel trucks from being routed through there, taking care of the young folks in those communities so that they get the education they need to have the jobs they need and want afterwards. I mean, it's basic stuff. There's no mystery to any of this, for heaven's sakes. I mean, we've learned for centuries. We try to educate our kids. We want them educated. One of the great dreams in America is first generation children whose parents never got to go to a good school or any school, and certainly never went to college, but they were able to work up the ladder and they took care of their kids, and their kids did go to college, and they do become engineers and doctors and teachers and so many other things we need. I just think it's a question of doing the fundamentals. We're just not even doing the fundamentals very well right now.
And wrapping up, I wanted to end on the next generation that you just alluded to. I know on your Twitter account, you posted a picture with one of your grandchildren, and I wonder what your hope is for that next generation.
Well, my hope is that we do exactly what we're setting out to do, that we leave this earth in better shape when we pass it on to the next generation than we found it. And I think that's our moral obligation. I think that's the standard by which we should operate. And anybody, and our grandchildren, likewise. I mean, that's why young people are screaming at adults today, telling them, fix it. You know, don't avoid your responsibility. Don't leave this place in a mess to us, you know, to try to clean up when it may be too late to clean it up. So I am completely, you know, heart and soul in lockstep with young folks who are out there, you know, shaking whatever you call it, the establishment or people in office or anything else. They are asking for common sense and basic morality to govern what we are deciding to do.
Well, it's clear that the calls of the youth are being heard right now. So thank you, Secretary Kerry, for joining us and sharing this information about these executive orders.
My pleasure. Great to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks so much, everyone, for watching. I'm Zinhle Essamuah, and we'll see you next time.